Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore the philosophy of consciousness and the mind-body problem. With me is Dr. David Chalmers, a professor of philosophy at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Dr. Chalmers is the author of The Conscious Mind in Search of a Fundamental Theory. Welcome, David.
Thanks.
It's a pleasure to be with you. One of the points that you have stressed in your writings and in your lectures on consciousness is that there are two ways of looking at consciousness. There's what you might call, or what you do call, the hard problem of consciousness, and there are many easy problems associated with consciousness that sometimes get confused with the hard problem.
Right. One thing one finds in this field is that there are any number of people working on the problem of consciousness from different points of view, from the viewpoint of psychology, of neuroscience, of philosophy, sometimes of physics, and so on. And everybody says, okay, I'm working on the problem of consciousness. I'm trying to explain consciousness. On the other hand, everybody means something slightly different by the term consciousness. So quite often what one finds is that when somebody says, I'm explaining consciousness, they're actually explaining many different things. So at the very start of the game, so to speak, the first thing one wants to do is to separate out what these different problems of consciousness are, the various things that might need explaining, because some of them turn out, I think, to be quite a lot easier than others.
And people talk about self-awareness or making value judgments or perceptions.
Well, the simplest level, for example, if you talk to, say, a neuroscientist who might be saying, okay, I'm now interested in explaining consciousness, they might be working on the problem then of explaining how it is that the brain and the sensory system can discriminate certain information in the world and react to it. So that would be the problem of discrimination. Or the problem of how it is that a system like a brain can integrate information from vision and audition and touch and so on, bring all this information together in the brain. And they might give a neuroscientific theory of that. Or indeed a theory of how it is we might talk about certain things. Now these are, and report certain conscious states. I can see you, I see Jeffrey Mishlove there, and I report that. Now these are all problems of consciousness in some sense. They all have a lot to do with consciousness.
Well, consciousness is complex.
Right. But there's a sense, though, in which all these problems are not the really tough mystery of consciousness. These are problems which are clearly tractable by the current scientific paradigm and work in neuroscience and computational theories and psychology, theories of how the brain works.
They're secondary problems.
Going to get us there. The central mystery, I think the real mystery which gets us going on the problem of consciousness in the first place, that leads people to say things like consciousness is the last great frontier of science, is the problem of subjective experience. How is it that all of these physical processes in a brain, we have maybe 100 or 1,000 billion neurons connected up in complex ways, firing away in all kinds of sophisticated patterns, but why does any of that give rise to a subjective inner life, to the kind of inner life that we all have, that consists of subjectively experienced colors, tastes, sounds, feelings, the stream of consciously felt emotion and of conscious thought. There's somebody home in here, and the question is, why is it that all that neural firing should give rise to a conscious inner life at all? And so far, I think, that problem is proving to be a lot less tractable than the others.
One writer has referred to it as, what is it like to be
That's
me,
right.
or to be you, or to be conscious as opposed to being a rock?
I think it's perhaps the central fact of human existence. There is something it's like to be a conscious human. I mean, there's something it's like to be me. I have a subjective inner life. I don't know that there's something it's like to be you. I presume there is. I think I've got pretty good reason to believe there is. If so, then you're conscious too. So we might even take that as a working definition of consciousness. You're conscious if there's something it's like to be you. Perhaps there's something it's like, for example, to be a dog. If so, then a dog is conscious. Perhaps there's not something it's like to be a rock. Who knows? If not, then a rock isn't conscious. That's at least a working definition of the term. And it's the most centrally interesting fact about the mind, that it has this subjective aspect to it.
Well, this is the mind-body problem, which is thousands of years old in philosophy, and yet our own inner awareness is the very first thing that we come upon. It's the basis upon which all science and all philosophy exists. It would seem to be less of a mystery than a bedrock.
Indeed. you might say that consciousness is at once the most familiar thing in the world and the most mysterious. Consciousness is what we start with. When it comes to knowing the world and looking out at the world, consciousness is what we have first. Everything else is secondary. I know that I exist. I know that I'm conscious. I think you probably exist, and there's a physical world out somewhere behind that. So in terms of what's familiar to me, gosh, consciousness is number one. But then in terms of accommodating that within a scientific worldview, it's fascinating that we've actually turned out to make much more progress on understanding such distant phenomena as subatomic particles or distant stars, not to mention the phenomena of chemistry, of biology, and of life, than we have of understanding our own consciousness. It almost sticks out like a sore thumb in the scientific picture. How is it that all these physical processes in the world should be associated with conscious experiences? And that's a problem which science, despite the familiarity of the phenomenon, has been almost silent on.
Well, to me, it's a paradox that you can't, to my way of thinking, you can't have science without consciousness.
Right.
And yet scientists, many of whom would maintain that they can they expect that they could arrive at a pretty complete picture of the universe that doesn't involve consciousness.
Right, indeed. So to do any consciousness, you've got to start, to do any science, you've got to start with the conscious mind. All the fundamental data we deal with are data of our experience. But it's interesting, science is so hooked on the idea of being, we're so hooked on the idea that to do proper science, you have to be objective. You have to eliminate anything subjective from the picture to build up a scientific framework. If every last remnant of consciousness, of subjective experience in those data gets eliminated and we push our theory, you give a scientific theory, for example, of heat or of light, and you give a theory of these physical phenomena of molecules moving fast in a hot object. One gives a theory of everything, it seems, all the objective aspects of heat. One leaves out actually the very central subjective aspect of hotness. Science doesn't actually give a theory of the conscious feeling of hotness. So science is actually built up on the idea that one has to eradicate the subjective to give these objective theories. If so, then when it comes to that works for a lot of phenomena. When it comes to giving a theory of consciousness itself, which is the paradigmatically subjective phenomenon, it seems that it may be that the methods of science have to be expanded.
Well, let's take this as an example, because almost every science student will learn that we have heat sensors that are part of our nervous system. They become activated. They send neural impulses up from the sensor along the nerves into the brain, and therefore we feel or perceive that heat. You're saying that doesn't really explain it.
Well, I think that you can tell a nice scientific story about what happens when the stuff in the environment hits the heat sensors. It sends a story up the optic nerve, and something happens in the brain, and some neurons wiggle up there, and so on. And then you said the last step, and therefore we feel it. Now that's the interesting step. How does that happen? How do those neurons firing and wiggling away inside the brain suddenly give rise to this subjective experience of hotness, the feeling of heat? Nothing in the scientific story, it seems, tells you why that has to happen. How does the water of the brain turn into the wine of consciousness? As far as everything in the scientific story is concerned, consciousness might as well not be there, it seems, from the third-person point of view. We might as well just be giant, unconscious automata, zombies, functioning in the world, reacting to those heat sensors, giving little reports like, gosh, that's hot, reacting to it, sweating a little bit maybe and moving away. Why do we need conscious subjective experience in that picture?
And classically, the mind-body problem is something like this. How do you take atoms and molecules and physical substances that possess no consciousness whatsoever, and from that derive consciousness? That's the classic problem, as I understand it.
That's precisely it. How is it that all of this matter adds up to something as complex and as interesting and as unique somehow as consciousness? That works so well in so many other domains, the method of explanation by reduction, trying to explain, take a high-level phenomenon like life and reproduction and give an explanation of it in terms of low-level phenomena such as the molecular biology of DNA and how DNA transmits information, stores information, transmits it from one generation to the next, plays a role in the development of an organism. Eventually one gets a developing organism which grows and reproduces and adapts, and one gets a nice scientific explanation of life. That method works so well in so many domains. What's interesting is when it comes to applying that to consciousness, it seems to some extent we're banging our head against a brick wall. When it comes to some phenomena, such as the phenomena of explaining how it is, the objective phenomena of explaining how it is we react and we talk and we integrate information and so on, those problems which I called earlier the easy problems, right, seems that the kind of reductionist methods at least have some promise there. When it comes to the problem of explaining why all that physical stuff should be accompanied by a subjective experience, that seems there's a different kind of question. It's what some philosophers have called an explanatory gap between the physical level and the level of consciousness. 'Cause no number, 10 neurons, 100 neurons, 1,000 neurons, 1,000 billion neurons, no matter how complex, nothing in that story seems to tell you why it is that anything should ever have a subjective feeling to it.
Well, of course, in recent decades, it seems as if there's been a big movement amongst the in philosophy, amongst the positivists and those who are students of, I believe it's Gilbert Ryle, when I was an undergraduate in college, we all read Gilbert Ryle, who pointed out to us that we had made a categorical mistake, that the problem of consciousness wasn't really a problem at all. It was a semantic problem, and if we'd only learn how to think about it differently, we would see that. They sort of have suggested that all of these centuries of agonizing about the problem was misguided.
There's a great tradition, actually, in philosophy and psychology, especially this century, of just that, of denying the problem. I mean, you can see a certain motivation for it. It certainly makes life a lot easier if that problem's not around. So earlier this century, for example, in psychology, there was the behaviorist movement that said to study the mind, all we're going to do is study behavior. All else is off limits. That allows the possibility, arguably, of an objective science of the mind, at cost, though, it seemed to many, of denying the most central phenomenon about the mind, the most central fact about the mind, which is that we are subjectively conscious. And psychology has gradually moved away from that. In philosophy, it's interesting, even more recently in philosophy, there's been a big movement to say, well, as philosophers these days, we're not going to be caught up in those ancient mysteries. We're going to be scientific. We're going to try and adapt our philosophy to the scientific worldview, and therefore we're going to deny any of these interesting, mysterious questions, which seem to lead us into the trap of being unscientific somehow. So, the movement of logical positivism, for example, in the 1940s, and philosophical behaviorism in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a groundswell towards just saying, okay, there's no problem here, it's all just a big semantic confusion. What's interesting, though, is actually in more recent years, I think, especially over the last 5 or 10 years, people have begun to realize, well, we almost convinced ourselves that there was no problem. Life was beginning to look a lot simpler, but the more you think about it, you realize, gosh, the problem just hasn't gone away. It's like that, that nagging itch. You can forget about for a while, and it comes back.
The leading proponent of reminding people that they haven't gotten rid of the problem. Some of the cognitive theorists have said, well, if we can solve all the little problems and then you add that all up, that's it. That's consciousness.
That's right. But what's interesting, actually, is when people don't talk about this stuff a whole lot. What's interesting, when you actually press people on it, when you talk people about it, almost everybody knows that there's a big problem here that we haven't yet solved. People have different attitudes towards it. Some people say, well, gosh, we can't even begin to solve that one yet. We'll work on all these simpler problems first. Other people say, well, sure, there's a problem there, but it's not science anyway. Gosh, I mean, it's subjective. It's not science, so we shouldn't need to worry about it. Some people deny there's a problem, but it's interesting that when I go around there, actually sometimes I do surveys, whether it's psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers. 3 out of 4 people say, gosh, there's a very serious problem here, which isn't being addressed by the current methods. What's interesting is, for the most part, people don't talk about it, and at least until very recently. And in recent years, people have actually started to talk about consciousness a little bit more centrally, and some of these problems are being brought directly into people's attention. And I think we're now entering into an exciting period where, for a long time, there's been a few little people here and there struggling away, making a little bit of progress, and little theories here and there on the problem. Now I think we're coming to a point where maybe we're going to see a more concerted effort for a number of people from different disciplines.
But at this point, at the end of the 20th century, it's probably fair to say that we don't have yet a scientific theory of consciousness.
I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, indeed, it's about as much of a problem that can sometimes seem as it ever was. We have a great theory of the brain. Or we don't have a great theory of the brain, but we have a pretty good theory, pretty good beginning theory.
We know about neurotransmission.
How neurotransmission works, how the different areas of the brain interact with each other, and what area does what, and rough principles of information processing that tells us what's responsible for vision, for language, and so on. Nothing in that has yet given us much insight into why that should be accompanied by subjective experience. And the interesting question, of course, is what it is we have to do, what it is we have to add to a theory to get consciousness in there.
Now, most of modern science is what you would call materialist. They're starting from a metaphysical premise of materialism. Maybe that's the problem right there.
I think materialism is a beautiful theory. It works so well in so many domains. You can give nice materialist theories of chemistry, where physics explains chemistry, of life, where physics and chemistry explain biochemistry, which explains the complex phenomena of life. Arguably, you can give materialist theories of phenomena such as the weather and of complex physical systems like that. So it's incredibly tempting to say, gosh, well, this has got to work everywhere. It works so well here. It's got to work for consciousness too. And indeed, for a long time, I was attracted to precisely this view myself. I think scientific materialism is such a beautiful, elegant, simple view of the world that you feel that sometimes you can get into the habit of thinking, gosh, it just has to be right. But the more you think about it, the more at least I come to the conclusion that it just doesn't work when it comes to consciousness. It provides great explanations of physical structures, the kind of structures we find in the world, in biological organisms, in the weather, and so on. And explanations of physical functions, the motion of physical objects, the functions, for example, that a biological system will perform, reproduction, adaptation, metabolism, maybe even the functions the brain performs, vision, language, and so on. But the problem of consciousness is not just a problem about structure and function, about those objective questions. There's a further question, even once one's explained, my physical structure and the functions I perform. The central further question is, why is all that accompanied by subjective experience? It's a different kind of question, almost unique, because it involves subjectivity.
And you argue, in fact, that in principle, materialism is incapable of really accounting for consciousness.
That's right, because materialism basically provides great explanations of structures and of functions, but it's ultimately limited to explaining structures and functions. When it comes to getting subjective experiences and feelings in there, there seems to be a systematic gap. One way to get at that point is to use an example due to the philosopher Frank Jackson, actually, an Australian philosopher, who talks about a neuroscientist somewhere in the future, maybe 300 years down the track. She's the world's leading neuroscientist of color vision. She understands everything there is to know about the neural processes of color vision in the brain, all the physical facts about the brain. But there's one interesting fact about this neuroscientist. She's lived her whole life in a black and white room. She's been brought up in a black and white room. She's only ever seen black, white, and shades of gray. Nevertheless, she knows all the physical facts about the brain. So she knows about the brain, she knows about its structure, she knows about the functioning of the color system, how it discriminates certain information from certain wavelengths in the environment, how it labels them with names like red and green. There's one central fact that despite possessing all that physical knowledge, there's one central fact she doesn't have, one central thing she doesn't know. She doesn't know what it's like to see red. She doesn't know what the conscious experience of red is like. That seems to indicate, gosh, that despite having all that physical information, nothing in any of that physical information adds up to something from which one can derive the existence of this conscious experience of red. That seems to be a further fact over and above all those physical facts. And that's one of the ways of bringing out, I think, why there are principal limitations for materialism.
So, as an alternative, you suggest a very interesting strategy that we posit a view that you call naturalism, which is very much like materialism, but it also accounts for consciousness as something fundamental. I can't quite tell whether or not you're a dualist, but it suggests that you're kind of a dualist. And
in a sense, insofar as being a dualist means you think consciousness is not something physical, then indeed I'm a kind of dualist. But my attitude to it, though, is to think of it as a kind of naturalism. And I'm very drawn by the scientific worldview, and I want to stay as close to that as possible, while still accommodating consciousness within the picture. And I think that the attitude one has to take is that one can be a scientific naturalist without being a materialist. And the attitude is something like this. To explain consciousness, we've had a particular problem of consciousness because what we've always been trying to do is explain consciousness wholly in terms of something else, in terms of something that's not. For example, in terms of some basic physical processes, some simpler physical processes, and trying to get all that to add up to consciousness and explain consciousness reductively, solely in terms of something simpler. That, it seems, doesn't work. On the other hand, it turns out if you look at science, if you look at the way science works, not all explanation is reductive explanation. There are some parts of science where one doesn't try and one does explain, life in terms of biochemistry and biochemistry in terms of chemistry. If you look at physics, for example, take categories like space and time and matter. I mean, nowhere in physics do you give a reductive explanation of space, explaining space in terms of something more fundamental. You take space as a primitive. Space is one of the basic components of your scientific theory. And then you take space and you take time as given, as fundamental features of the world. Then you go and try and build up a theory of them, the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics and so on. So my suggestion is when it comes to consciousness, we ought to do something similar. There's a perfectly good naturalistic move available to us. Instead of trying to reduce consciousness to something else, take it as given. Take it as a fundamental part of the world. Take it as a fundamental property in nature, and then try and build up a theory of it.
Well, I like that idea, and of course it's very akin to many other metaphysical positions aside from materialism, particularly some of the Asian philosophical systems. But within the Western system, it seems to me that you're now in danger of running up against people who say, well, you can't have consciousness without a brain. It's dependent upon a physical system. We know that, so you're giving up too soon.
Actually, I don't deny that consciousness is dependent on a physical system. And certainly all the instances of consciousness we know of actually depend on or associated with physical systems like brains. Nothing in what I'm saying is intended to deny that. I take that as almost sort of as common sense.
Yeah.
So it's a fact, I think, that consciousness, at least the instance of it that we know, all are associated with brains. But what I would reject then is trying to explain consciousness fully in terms of the brain. You can tell a story about the brain processes. That'll never tell you why consciousness exists. But what I would suggest instead is that consciousness exists. It's a fundamental feature of the brain and of the world, over and above the physical properties of the brain. What one then needs is a theory which crosses the explanatory gap between physical processes in the brain and the subjective phenomena of conscious experience. There, I suggest that what one needs, just as in physics one invokes fundamental laws like the law of gravity and the law of quantum mechanics, laws of quantum mechanics to explain how these physical fundamental features arise. I think one needs something which you might call fundamental psychophysical laws to explain how it is that the phenomena of subjective experience are associated with certain phenomena in the brain and in physical systems more generally, perhaps. So we may have certain psychophysical laws that tell us under certain physical conditions, there are certain physical parameters which are associated in a very definite and systematic way with certain properties of conscious experience. And it will be those psychophysical laws, those fundamental laws, which actually cross the gap. So consciousness will still arise from processes in the brain. You just won't be able to reduce consciousness to a process in the brain.
Now, I know many of your colleagues in the cognitive areas and philosophy of mind are going to say, well, this is all very nice, but you have to follow the rule of Occam's razor. You can't postulate a new fundamental until you've absolutely exhausted every other possibility. And for example, there are those who would say something like this, that there's a neurological feedback loop that goes on in the brain. First you have a sensation, and the brain registers the sensation, and then you have another neuron that registers the registration of the sensation, and when you repeat that enough times, billions of times potentially in the brain, all of those sensations, aware of themselves, create a kind of self-consciousness in the brain, and that might explain it.
So that last little step, the creation of the kind of self-consciousness, it always involves a little bit of sort of hand-waving, a little bit of magic almost in the theory. It's tremendously attractive, but when you think about what it is these physical theories give you, all these feedback loops and so on, they just give you more complex structure, more complex function, something analogous perhaps to a computer system or a camera turning on itself, watching a picture of itself and so on. Gives you all kinds of fascinating, complex, dynamic phenomena. But the question arises for those just as strongly as it ever did. Why is it that all of these complex, dynamic, self-referential loops should add up to a subjective experience? And in all these theories, I think that step is something akin to magic. Now, all I say is that when you've got that step, you can't call it magic. You've got to make that step explicit in your theories. Once you make that step explicit in your theories, I think you're going to end up having to invoke something like these psychophysical laws. Now, I think it's right in a sense that this theory is more complex. It is more complex than standard materialism, and I think one should take Occam's razor very seriously. And there are days when I look at my theory and think, gosh, well, can that be right? It's postulating all this extra stuff. I mean, it seems kind of, gosh, is this crazy or what? But on the other hand, Occam's razor says, don't multiply entities without necessity. And I think in this case, one can actually give systematic arguments to show there is necessity here, why no physical theory will ever actually, in and of itself, add up to a theory of consciousness. It may get you a lot of the way there, but you're always going to need something else to cross that gap, and that extra gap is going to require these.
Well, it's
new
interesting
elements.
because you're trying to start with the scientific method, and it seems you're moving your position at least a little bit closer to where other philosophers started in the first place. The idealists, for example, said that it's all consciousness. Time, space, matter, and energy are all derived from consciousness.
Right. Well, I started off with it in the scientific worldview. My background was actually in mathematics and physics, and even as I've moved through this field and working in philosophy of mind, I still like to keep my hand in by working in artificial intelligence and doing computational models of mental processes and so on. So I'm always trying to stay as close to science as I can, just be as conservative as possible and just move out as much as you need to bring the phenomena in. And in this case, I think it's turned out one needs to move out a little bit. One needs to expand the worldview beyond what I originally thought. I would have to bring consciousness in. I don't think one is forced to move as far as idealism, where all there is in the world is the mind. I think that would be really a radical move. I mean, in the sense, I think we've got very good evidence that physical reality exists, and our physical theories are just so strong in their own right. They're closed, they're consistent, they explain so much that I'm generally think it's a good idea to take such theories at face value. But that's just idealism. I think almost commits the reverse mistake, trying to reduce everything in physics to what's in the mind. I don't think that works. I don't think the other thing works either. Trying to reduce everything that's in the mind to what's in physics. So I guess what I say is you have something which is physical, which is there and fundamental, something which is mental.
So your naturalism is a way perhaps of combining these two views or synthesizing them, and you even go so far as to suggest, which we'll explore in part 2 of this 2-part series, that we may in the future build conscious robots.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it seems often, when you think about how mysterious consciousness is and how strange it is, it can seem awfully strange to think, how could it be that a bunch of silicon chips in a computer or a robot should add up to consciousness? And indeed, that seems strange. On the other hand, it seems just as strange. How could it be that 1,000 billion neurons in the brain could somehow interact in a complex way to give you consciousness? Nevertheless, we know that somehow it happens with the neurons. Somehow they give you consciousness, if only through the action of some of these psychophysical laws. Yeah. If they do it in that case, I can see no reason why silicon chips are intrinsically any worse off than biological neurons when it comes to this. They both seem equally apt or equally inapt, if you like. Well, so I can't exclude the possibility of computer consciousness.
David Chalmers, our time has run out, so it's been a pleasure having this discussion with you. Thanks so much for being with me.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for being with us, and check your program listings for part 2 of this 2-part series on the philosophy of consciousness, where we will begin to explore some of the new models for consciousness, including the possibility of conscious robots.